Hey, Adam here, and welcome back. Almost everyone has heard of the Dyatlov Pass incident that took place in Soviet Russia back in 1959, but there are some, including myself, who hadn't heard of the Khamar Daban Incident, so thank you to Zuzana for suggesting this video. Almost 2,000 miles to the southeast of Dyatlov Pass lies the Khamar Daban mountain range. This apparently is a popular area for Russian hikers and for tourists as well. In 1993, the year I was born, 6 of these hikers would enter these mountains, but only 1 would return. With such a harrowing experience that after the initial police report, she refused to talk about it ever again. Now, Lyudmila Koronova was a 41-year-old survivalist and hiking instructor that held a lot of experience under her belt, and she was the person who organised this trip. Both her students and peers held a lot of respect for Lyudmila and regarded her as a master of the wilderness. By some accounts, she was quite harsh on her students and really pushed to get the best out of them, though in fairness, her students did describe her as a good teacher. Her methods went without their critics though. Do bear in mind that as we progress through this video, that I've had to translate a lot of this from Russian, and while it would be impossible without Google Translate, it doesn't get you all the way there. I knew her, Lyudmila, long before this incident. She was a very beautiful, strong-willed, athletic woman. Once we crossed paths with her in the north of Lake Baikal in Kakusi. Lyudmila was with 2 boys between 16 and 17 years old, and they came down to our camp. The guys looked haggard and one of them could not even lift an axe to chop wood. We offered them tea and bread. They were so eager it was as if they had never eaten anything before. I asked what was wrong with them, and Lyudmila replied, stating that she was practicing some kind of survival school. The group would venture on hikes with a minimum of food and clothing. She made the point that she was teaching them to be ready for various unforeseen situations. I was outraged. These are teenagers. They need to eat well, especially with such loads. Yuri was responsible for the later search and rescue with the group, and if it's not clear, he seemed to lay the blame for this incident at Lyudmila's feet. I bring this up to highlight Lyudmila's character and the various opinions about her. On the one hand, her students seemed to think a great deal about her, whereas Yuri perhaps questioned her methods and thought that she was a bit too harsh. On the 2nd of August 1993, she and 6 of her students arrived at the town of Marino nearby the mountain range. This wasn't the only hiking party in the area. Another was led by her daughter Natalia, who Lyudmila had taught and was mentoring her leadership abilities as well as wilderness skills. There was one other hiking group too, but I don't believe there was any relationship to speak of, and they were doing their own thing. Lyudmila and Natalia, on the other hand, had planned to go their separate ways with their respective groups and to meet back up later, where they would then continue as a larger group. If you haven't guessed, this incident centres around Lyudmila's group, who consisted of 7 altogether. Lyudmila herself, 23-year-old Alexander Krysin, 24-year-old Titania Filipenko, 19-year-old Denis Shvakin, 16-year-old Victoria Zylsova, 15-year-old Timur Bapanov, and finally 17-year-old Valentina Utachenko. Lyudmila was said to have a great relationship with her students, but Alexander specifically she was very fond of and had known him since he was very young. Medium.com describes, Lyudmila had known Alexander for most of his life and considered him to be almost a son to her. Lyudmila was close to the rest of her students too, but not in the same way that she was with Alexander, where there seemed to have been a fair bit of history. On that day, the group set off from Marino and were all in high spirits about their upcoming journey together. Lyudmila was somewhat meticulous about her plans, and she ensured that she'd picked a time where good weather was forecast and she was expecting sunny skies with barely any clouds to speak of. However, Lyudmila and her daughter unknowingly embraced each other for the final time, agreeing to meet up again on the 5th at a pre-arranged location where their paths would cross again. Only this meeting would never happen and the 2 groups split up and went their separate ways. As mentioned, everyone was in high spirits this day and they were all eager to prove themselves to one another and their peers and to graduate in some sense from being fledgling survivalists. This is a group who were all very fond of one another and had managed to brew an air of companionship in their months of planning and learning leading up to the trip. Sputnik.kz reported, over the first couple of days, Lyudmila's group managed to overcome a significant part of the route, approximately 70 kilometers. On the 4th of August, the group draws to a halt at a height of 2,300 meters. This would be their last stop. It is noted that this place is a completely bare part of the mountains. It is compared to Martian landscapes. There is practically no vegetation and no creatures are to be found here, only stones, grass and cold winds. The group spent the night at this place. The weather day and night stubbornly discouraged the group of travellers. Contrary to optimistic forecasts, a Mongolian cyclone came to the region. Since the 3rd of August, all the mountain knew was snow and rain around the clock. So we have a situation now where the forecasts were completely wrong, shock, and the mountain was being hit by a pretty harsh rainstorm. A decision was made now by Lyudmila, and it's not completely clear why she did this, and it marks the first odd turn of events in this situation. I'm going to quote again from the article. Why did a group of tourists stop at such a place, so exposed to the elements? From that moment on, history begins to speculate wildly. Legends and superstitions were born, trying to explain what had happened. On the one hand, the group could easily have descended 400 metres to the nearby forest. In such conditions, one could already dream of a nice warm fire. There was, according to local rescuers, another option, to climb to the top where a special platform was located. There was firewood and a place to rest. It was only 30 minutes to go to this point. One explanation given for this was that their maps may have been inaccurate, though I'm not sure I understand that completely, given that 400 metres isn't that far, and in theory you should be able to see it clearly. Though in fairness, there may be some added complexity to the situation, given that they were on a mountain. This has been a massive point of contention it seems. The counter-argument was that Lyudmila was highly experienced, meticulous, and had been planning this hike for many months. Some believe that Lyudmila may have seen something in the direction of the forest that made her uncomfortable about approaching, such as an animal, because at the end of the day, she will have known that heading into the forest was probably the ideal move. I'm sure there are factors that we can't fully appreciate sitting nicely here at our keyboards. Some believe that she may have seen something that she wasn't supposed to see, and we'll get to that piece of speculation later. For now though, we have an odd decision that was made, and from what I can gather, the reasoning behind the decision has never received an agreed explanation. It could just be as simple as that they were tired and cold and wanted a place to rest immediately. Though I do understand the back and forth arguments being presented, because it would have been difficult to have chosen a worse place to set up camp. There was no cover to speak of, and heavy rains pummeling down on them. It does make you wonder what the specifics of the situation were, and why they didn't head to the forest. Medium.com summarises that quite nicely. Lyudmila decided to camp out hastily in an exposed location, despite there being tree cover not far away. The group was unable to build a fire that night, but was still in good spirits. The morning afterwards, while the weather hadn't completely cleared up, Lyudmila and the rest of the group were able to get a fire going, and they enjoyed breakfast together. There wasn't going to be anything else enjoyable about this day though, and it rapidly descended into a nightmare that very few could even imagine. If you rightly remember, this was the day that Lyudmila and the group were going to meet up with her daughter. Well, this reunion would never take place. Lyudmila was said to be confident this day, presumably inspired that they'd managed to ascend quicker than they thought they'd be able to. Lyudmila and the rest never made it to Natalia, and at that time Natalia didn't actually think much of it. From what I understand, it seems as though she had appropriately reasoned that the weather had probably just set them back. This second group just continued on their way like nothing was wrong. However, they couldn't have been more mistaken. This is a quote from the sole survivor, Valentina Utachenko, while talking to the authorities. August 5, 10 AM. Alexander came and said that they were wet and freezing. Author's note, from where and when Alexander came is unclear. Perhaps from tent to tent. It was snowing, no landmarks were visible. We collected our backpacks and began to go down the wall. We walked about 10 metres and Alexander began to fall. They began to help him up, but he fell again. Lyudmila remained beside him. She told the rest of us to keep descending, but almost immediately she stopped the group and asked someone to follow her. Tanya took out a canopy and the others used it for cover. I went up to Lyudmila. Alexander's eyes were huge, an indifferent look. Lyudmila felt for a pulse and said that there was no heartbeat. She asked me to bring Victoria down. I went to her and she bit me. I dragged her to the rest. Tatiana began banging her head against the stones. Dennis hid behind the stones and climbed into the sleeping bag. I crawled to Lyudmila, but she was not breathing. I tried to raise Timur. When I realised that no one was moving, I began to go down to the trees. I got dressed and laid down in my sleeping bag, covered with a canopy. In the morning, I went up, saw Tanya on the stones, Dennis, Timur, Victoria. Above Alexander and Lyudmila, none of them rose again. This was only part of the description. I'd noticed that many other sources gave other details, including hemorrhaging, and it took me a while to confirm that this had happened. Other sources had also said that Victoria bit Lyudmila, and bear in mind that I've had to translate the situation, but it very much reads like she bit Valentina. At a much later date, Valentina was being questioned about the incident again, and she was asked whether Lyudmila was to blame. Valentina said, "In no way was this Lyudmila's fault. It was very cold at the top. It was early morning and we were asleep. Lyudmila awoke us and ordered us to pack up our things and go down into the gorge. She tried to save us. I just didn't have time. The wind was so strong that we slipped down instead of walking." Suddenly, Alexander fell. He was frothy at the mouth. Lyudmila sat down next to him, hugged him, and that was all. He didn't get up. Then the madhouse began, and I still don't understand how long it lasted. Everyone falls and everyone begins foaming at the mouth, and hemorrhaging from the nose. Many sources stated that the hemorrhaging was also from the eyes and the ears, but if this was the case, I wasn't able to find the original report or any indication that Valentina had stated that. It's important, of course, because if the specifics of the incident get muddled or exaggerated, then there's absolutely no way anyone could ever diagnose what happened. And let's be clear, it's not as if this incident wasn't already weird enough anyway. I find Valentina's description very interesting, and I think it's worth summarising this. As she points out, whatever happened to these people started with Alexander, in that he was at the back of the group when he began frothing at the mouth, hemorrhaging from the nose, and then collapsed to the ground. Lyudmila then quickly made her way to Alexander, obviously in shock, started to tend to him, and the rest of the group were nearby and she told them to carry on. Lyudmila then turns herself and begins to feel unwell. She quickly calls for the group to help her, and the remaining 5 then notice that she's also frothing at the mouth and hemorrhaging from the nose. She then loses consciousness on top of Alexander. I can't even imagine what the remaining members of the group were thinking at this point. Probably, what is happening and am I next? Tatiana, who was particularly brave, then went over to Lyudmila in the hopes of helping her. However, she then also ended up with the same symptoms and proceeded to crawl over to a rock where, I'm not going to repeat what she did, but it shows how horrific the experience must have been, that she wanted to lose consciousness sooner. I don't know. Victoria and Timur, rightly so, then decided to leave the area and they started running away downhill, only for both of them to fall with the same symptoms. This leaves Dennis and Valentina. Dennis, as we heard, hid behind a rock and then crawled into a sleeping bag. From her description, I'm also assuming that he suffered from the same symptoms too. The pressing question becomes, what in the world could have caused everyone but Valentina to have experienced these symptoms? Was it the specific area that was causing the problem? Would these symptoms have appeared had they managed to leave the area earlier? We'll take a look at these questions and more shortly, and we'll go through some of the hypotheses as well as the official diagnosis. Right, now we're at the point where Valentina bolts and gets out of there. I can only assume that she thought something environmental was happening, some sort of gas oozing in the area or something like that. Obviously, there was no way that she could have known, but she did make a pretty tremendous effort of sprinting down the mountain towards a cluster of trees to get out of there. Valentina didn't actually have any supplies at all now, other than the clothes on her back and the tent that she'd managed to pack away earlier that morning. You can only imagine the state that she must have been in as she sat down with her back against the tree, just scared for her life, wondering if she was going to suffer the same fate, whatever that then was. At this point, she'd managed to put the tent up, and completely exhausted, she fell asleep there. Now, Valentina said that when she got her bearings and she realised that she was okay, she came to the realisation that she was now alone and had absolutely no chance of surviving without going back to her fallen friends and retrieving some of the supplies. I can't imagine that it was very encouraging having to return to the site where this unfolded, and then again having to wonder if returning would make you fall too. Valentina said that when she arrived at the scene, nobody had moved an inch from when she last saw them, so she knew for definite that they weren't with her anymore. From what I can gather, she collected supplies from each of the bodies on the ground and closed her eyes before leaving. Luckily, there were power lines not too far away, and she followed them for 4 days down the mountain which led her to the Snezhaya River. She knew that this river was well frequented and hoped that she'd be found there, which she was on the 4th day by some kayakers, so the 9th of August. Now I don't know how to quite make sense of this next part, but the kayakers took care of her and then got her to the nearest police station. She told the police of this entire ordeal, but there was no search organised until the 24th of August, so just over 2 weeks after reporting to the authorities. I have no idea why they waited for over 2 weeks before starting the search. The bodies were then found on the 26th of August, and Medium.com reported, an autopsy report concluded that they had all passed away as a result of hypothermia, except for Ludmilla, who had suffered a heart attack. They all had signs of bruised lungs and protein deficiency due to malnutrition, was listed as a contributing factor to their passing. This incident was ultimately ruled accidental. Compared to the testimony of Valentina, this ruling is strange and is central to many of the hypotheses in this case. That it is, and we're going to get into some of these. First of all, hypothermia can't have been the only contributing factor given that they were frothing at the mouth and hemorrhaging are not symptoms of that. Let's have a further look at the official diagnosis, and this was reported by the KP.RU. The official final verdict, it was hypothermia alongside protein degeneration. In 1993, Biojat forensic experts established during an autopsy that all members of the group passed away as a result of hypothermia. This is what Konstantin Yugov, the head of the Bureau of Forensic Medical Examination, had to say. When we received the 6 bodies for examination, our goal was clear: to unravel the mystery of the cause of their passing. First, could it be that they passed from hypothermia alone? Secondly, could they have been poisoned by something? Third, are there any injuries on the bodies? We carefully studied the conditions under which this incident occurred. It was necessary to determine what could have happened here. It all happened high in the mountains with low temperatures and heavy rain, plus a lot of physical activity and oxygen starvation. In such conditions, people can pass away quickly. There were similar cases when under similar circumstances, people passed away of hypothermia within 2 hours. Autopsy revealed signs of general cooling of the body. The muscles lack nutrients, and this gave rise to the hypothermia diagnosis. In addition, experts identified pulmonary edema and changes in the heart, liver and lungs, characteristic of protein dystrophy in the victims. This only indirectly allows one to say that they could starve. Just so we're all on the same page, this is a description of pulmonary edema from mayoclinic.org. This is a condition caused by excess fluid in the lungs. The fluid collects in the numerous air sacs in the lungs, making it difficult to breathe. In most cases, heart problems cause pulmonary edema, but fluid can collect in the lungs for other reasons, including pneumonia, exposure to certain toxins and medications, trauma to the chest wall, and travelling to or exercising at high elevations. Right, what Konstantin Yugov's actually saying there too is that you can't use the diagnosis as a definitive explanation, but rather indirectly hints that they weren't having enough food, had hypothermia and this pulmonary edema. However, Valentina herself seems to have unknowingly countered this idea of starvation. She was specifically asked how many times a day did you eat? She replied, 4 times a day for sure. Hot food is a must. They made a fire and cooked. In addition, we had snacks at each stop. We had cereals, milk powder, crackers, stew, carrots, beets, onions, sweets, chocolates. The calculation was based on 2,400 calories per person per day. I'm obviously no medical professional or anything like that, but the symptoms do line up somewhat with what has been said. For example, sudden pulmonary edema symptoms include a rapid, irregular heartbeat alongside anxiety, which in Ludmilla's case, together might have been particularly bad and caused a heart attack. It also causes a cough that produces frothy sputum. However, I can't help but note that hemorrhaging doesn't seem to be a symptom of pulmonary edema or obviously hypothermia. And Valentina never actually mentioned coughing, but rather that they were simply frothing at the mouth. I can certainly see why Konstantin leaned in that direction, but there does seem to be some conflicting information, and regarding the idea of starvation too. I can also understand the many arguments put forth, suggesting that the official diagnosis is not exactly a perfect fit either. One of the rescuers named Vladimir Zinov, also an expert of these wilderness areas, had this to say. Bad weather is not the cause of their passing. Ludmila led the group along the upper reaches very close to a forest. You go down into that forest and you are safe, a lit fire, cooked food and warmed up. August is a great time to be here. Mushrooms, berries, wild garlic are plentiful at this time. Zinov believes that the tourists had a minor mountain sickness. It occurs at an altitude of more than 2,000 meters and exacerbated by oxygen starvation. They passed away at an altitude of more than 2,300 meters. Weakness, headache, nausea accompany the sickness. Valentina's explanation doesn't describe nausea. Weakness and apathy are evident, but why didn't they go down to the forest? Now this is where some have turned to the more unusual explanations, and in all fairness, as I mentioned earlier, why they didn't head towards the forest is a good question, and it's never really received a satisfactory answer that everyone agrees on. Some people believe that the decision to not go into the forest and their demise were not isolated incidents, but were linked. One hypothesis that you can find discussed a lot is the idea that they may have seen something that they weren't supposed to see. I want to make it clear that I don't give credence to any of the hypotheses, I'm just simply relaying them. Now, this idea postulates that there may have been military activities in the area, specifically towards the remote forest that the group decided not to venture into. The argument goes that it could very well make sense that if they'd seen soldiers or personnel of some description on the ground down there, that would have probably dissuaded them from approaching. And thus, they set up their temporary camp in that terrible position because to them, the forest was a no-go. Secondarily to this, just assuming it's true, if there were personnel on the ground down there, they could have misinterpreted Ludmila's group as being foreign spies and as a result, sought to get rid of them. It's worth noting here actually that the route that the group took wasn't perfect and they did manage to stray from their plan a bit, which took them to a more remote area where they then passed away. However, this idea potentially starts to fall apart when you think about the logistics of the situation, in that it's summer and that is typically the time when the mountain would be at its most active. From what I can tell, in summer, there are always multiple groups hiking in the area. It's obviously not bustling or anything like that, but there are small pockets of people scattered around. As the Medium article points out, surely Siberia would be a much better location for this kind of activity because it ensures a high degree of privacy, as opposed to this mountain in prime-time tourist season. Then there's the obvious problem that Valentina was allowed to leave. In this hypothesis, you then have to explain why. Was she missed? Didn't they know that she was there? You can't really hide in this area. I'm sure you can see the problems amassing here. Another theory that I've seen talked about is that the group may have been suffering from rabies. This is because the group seemed to be displaying some of the symptoms associated with the disease, such as foaming at the mouth, aggression, convulsions, muscle spasms, bizarre or strange thoughts. Valentina did get bit. One of the persons involved was doing something fairly disturbing with a certain rock, so there was certainly bizarre behaviour being displayed. However, I find it quite difficult to get on board with this one, because from what I understand, rabies has an incubation period of a few days to months or longer. I can't imagine that they all start to present this disease at the exact same time, since the incubation period is likely going to be different for everyone. It also raises the question of how they might have got it in the first place, and with an incubation period that's widely varied like this, it's hard to even hazard a guess. Perhaps one of them had it, and whoever it was then accidentally responsible for passing it along to the rest of the group over time. According to one research study published in 2018, rabies is endemic to Russia, so I suppose it's not completely out of the realm of possibility. It's just odd to me that they would all start to present at the exact same time. I've never heard of that before. If there's anyone watching who's in the medical field or knows more about rabies in general, then please do leave a comment on that. I'd be interested in hearing what you have to say. The next idea is somewhat similar to the first proposed hypothesis, that is that they may have unknowingly entered an area where nerve agents were either being tested or dumped. Alexander was the first to fall, so he could have either touched something and it was absorbed through the skin, or obviously he could have breathed it in. This kinda makes sense since it started with him. Ludmilla then touched him and she could also have absorbed it in the same way. The rest of the group are further away, but it does look like at some point they all came into contact with Ludmilla and Alexander, so that could explain how they all got it as well. But even if that is the case, then you still have to explain why it didn't affect Valentina, which obviously I can't do. Perhaps she was just out of range the entire time and then managed to run off before she came into contact with it, though she did later return to the area to retrieve supplies. It's difficult to really speculate in any meaningful way because I just don't know enough about nerve agents. I've done a little bit of reading and it seems like one possible way it might have started is if Alexander had melted some snow to drink and had basically unwittingly drank the agent. A lot of people seem to be of the opinion that if it had been dumped there in the past, in theory it should have lost its potency over time before completely being neutralised altogether. However, one of the creators of Novichok nerve agents did say in 2018 that he was surprised to learn just how long his series of nerve agents hung around for. While another developer, Vladimir Ugalov, said this: "Unlike some of my colleagues, I've always said it's very stable. It can persist for years with nothing much happening to it. There is a very, very slow process of evaporation. According to the now retired scientist, Novichok can bury itself in paint, trees and perhaps in wooden benches. It can get in and remain there for a very long time. If it is on a neutral surface, it will only degrade on account of evaporation, and that would be a long process. I suppose then, in theory, if it was found to be a dumping ground, then it's possible. I also found out that nerve agents may also coincide with the fact that they all frothed at the mouth and had nosebleeds. Ingesting or absorbing these agents can also cause respiratory distress and bruising of the lungs. Cardiac arrest is also caused by this, so you could in theory argue that the autopsy does match with this hypothesis in some ways. As mentioned though, I think the crux of this idea is that Valentina herself survived, and I, a complete layman mind you, can't really think of a way to account for that, because from Valentina's description, everyone suffered the same symptoms, and everyone had been in close proximity. There's also an argument presented by the Medium article that suggests that the rainstorm could have played a key role in this. Let's assume the site isn't a dumping ground, but rather an even more discreet location nearby was being used as a testing site. The rainstorm could have washed the substance downhill to that location. In this case, Alexander could have been very unfortunate if he'd walked over a particularly high concentration of the agent, and that's where the trouble started, as then the grunt members started to interact with one another. It's certainly a possibility, I suppose. Another explanation here is that Valentina's description isn't completely accurate, or I have just misinterpreted a couple of key points in her description. Another proposed hypothesis is in regards to the actual water supply being contaminated by something. In northern Siberia, there seems to be an unusually high incidence rate of cancer. It's thought that one of the reasons for this might be that some Russian booster rockets that they obviously used for spaceflight came crashing down in the area. And it may be the case that fuel from said rockets managed to leak and find its way into the local water supply. The idea then becomes, could something similar have happened here, but in a higher concentration? Depending on what the substance was that leaked into the water supply, you could have a whole range of different outcomes in terms of symptoms and the particularly troubling behaviours displayed. I imagine during the time they were having breakfast together would have been the time that they also drank some water, which would have been the point of ingestion. That is of course just one of the hypotheses though, and needless to say, but there's no way of knowing if that's what happened or not. I've not seen this one mentioned yet, but I do know of at least one disappearance in which a person was reported missing, and after the search eventually found them, they couldn't identify a cause of passing. Well, what they found upon studying the site was that gas from beneath the area sometimes manages to seep out, and that was then found to be the cause. It's not impossible that something similar could have happened here. Of course, I don't have any evidence in favour of that mind you, and the cases I'm familiar with involve bodies of water where the gas seeps out of. I've seen other ideas too, such as perhaps mushrooms were to blame. Ludmilla was a great forager, so it's possible I suppose that she could have brought back dangerous mushrooms. Though you'd like to think that she'd have known what was safe and what wasn't. And even in this scenario, Valentina still remains the outlier. It's actually quite difficult in trying to determine what happened here. You can see why the medical professionals came to the conclusion of hypothermia, potential protein degeneration, and pulmonary edema. However, I actually do think that they failed to provide an adequate explanation as to why it affected everyone at exactly the same time and in the exact same way without any real variation at all, at least from Valentina's account. I'm not saying the official diagnosis should be completely ruled out or anything like that, but it does seem lacking in my, in all fairness, medically uneducated opinion. I think opinions vary a lot too, because there are many who believe that the decision not to head down towards the forest was linked to what happened. Whichever way you look at it though, Valentina, for reasons I can't explain very well, was a complete outlier in the situation. Something affected every single person in the exact same way at basically the exact same time. All but Valentina. That can only really mean one of two things in my mind. Either she was physically able to avoid whatever it was that had happened, whether it was a substance or a disease or something else, or she had some kind of genetic disposition to being immune or resistant against whatever it was. And in that second line of thinking, I suppose you have to rule out the idea of nerve agents or natural harmful gases. That's not the case if she just somehow managed to avoid it, obviously. I mean, these are just some of the hypotheses, some get pretty wild and out there too. If you've been here for a while, similar to other mountains around the world you and I have looked at, you get accusations that the hikers had angered spirits on the mountain, other suggestions like something from above maybe to blame, or just some kind of sinister force. It's difficult to really get into those because there's no tangible or in-depth information that I can find to present. The Occam's razor interpretation probably lies somewhere close to the medical professionals carrying out the autopsy, though as I said before, I'm not sure if it completely explains everything based on Valentina's observations, unless she was mistaken about some parts of the incident. This happening to everyone at once and the exact same way, I think is a real problem area because it makes it somewhat difficult to explain without involving something environmental or something that had been ingested by everyone at roughly the same time. In any case, I'm going to hand this one over to you in the comments below. What do you make of this incident? Do you find it weird too, or is it easily explainable in your mind? Which hypothesis do you prefer? With all of that said, I'd just like to thank you for watching, and a special thank you to the patrons as well, who I really can't thank enough. If you found this video interesting, then please do hit the like button, and if not, then feel free to give it a thumbs down. I'm just looking for your honest opinion either way. I hope that you've had a great day, or evening, depending on where you are, and I'll see you in the next one. Be safe guys. Peace.